Okay. I would just like to thank Corey Leonard from the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies for all his support for this lecture series, which has been an interdisciplinary lecture series. So we've had history professors, we've had Spanish professors, and this is the first time we've had a professor of political science to come here. So we're very happy to have Professor Holzner. I would also like to thank Brian O'Daly, who he does the wonderful posters for the lecture series. He's been doing those for the last year and a half. So, well, we're fortunate here at BYU to have a lot of faculty who are very involved with research dealing with Latin America and many disciplines. But it's also important to remember that just a few minutes away from us, there is the University of Utah, which as a research university hosts much scholarship having to do with Latin America, and that's part of the reason why we asked Professor Holzner to come here, because he does have a specialty that we don't have here at BYU, which is studying contemporary Mexican politics. So after Professor Holzner received a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan in 2002, he has been a part of the faculty at the University of Utah, where he's currently an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, in addition to serving as the associate director of the university's Latin American Studies program. Professor Holzner's research and teaching interests are principally focused on Latin America and include contemplative politics, political development, political economy, political participation and social movements, democratization, immigration, and regime change. In addition to numerous journal articles, his research of political participation has produced his recent book, titled Poverty of Democracy: The Institutional Roots of Political Participation in Mexico, published by Pittsburgh University Press in 2010. Now, none of us can dispute Mexico's prominent role resulting from its being a neighbor of the United States, as well as being a key player in our hemisphere's economic and political activity. That being the case, Mexico's recent presidential elections have been given considerable attention in the international press, and many thoughts have turned to the problems facing Mexico's political system. We then are honored to hear from Professor Holzner today, whose lecture, titled What's Wrong with Mexico's Democracy, will certainly hold great relevance to all of us interested in Mexico's future. Please join me in welcoming Professor Holzner.
Second one.
Yeah, let me. Sorry.
While he's putting that up, I want to thank BYU for inviting me to give a talk here today, and also to the Harold B. Library for this invitation. I'm especially pleased to be here at BYU because some of you may know, some of you may not, that the Latin American Studies programs at our two institutions, the University of Utah and BYU, are collaborating more and more closely. We're moving to develop a consortium and to apply for some joint grants. And so I see my participation here, my talk here, as part of this growing, hopefully sort of long-lasting collaboration between the Latin American Studies programs between the two institutions. We do not need to be rivals, right, in everything. So, again, thank you very much. So the talk is on Mexico. This is a map of Mexico. Two things to note that are sort of relevant for the talk today. The first is how close Mexico is to the United States. That's pretty obvious, right? And the second thing that I'd like you to note is that it's a federal system, right? That is that Mexico is composed, much like the United States, of states. In fact, its legal name, right, its birth name is the United States of Mexico. Its constitution is modeled very closely after the U.S. Constitution. There are 31 states in a federal district, much like the District of Columbia. Mexico City is a federal district, so it has its own kind of system of government. And that's relevant because, like the United States, and we just had presidential elections in the U.S., sort of to follow this analogy, not all states are created equal, right? In some places, politics functions one way, and in other states, politics functions a different way. Some places it's better, some places it's worse. Florida seems to be the state that we beat up on lately, right, as a place that can't quite get their elections right. The same is true for Mexico. As political scientists, we often tend to generalize about whole countries, and ignore the diversity within. And I don't mean, for the purposes of this talk, I don't mean ethnic or religious or linguistic diversity. I mean political diversity, different political systems. In essence, there are 32 political systems in Mexico, just like there are 51 if we count Puerto Rico, right? Different political systems in the United States. And they function very differently, some better, some worse. And that's going to be an important part of this talk. And in unpacking what's wrong with Mexico's democracy, I'm going to dig into subnational politics, that is, politics below the national level, and see what kind of lessons we can learn about democracy, about Mexican politics, and so on. I'll give you the answer to the question, what's wrong with Mexico's democracy, right off the top. There's a lot of things wrong with Mexico's democracy. I'm not a fan. I am from Mexico, by the way, so I can say these things. I'm not a fan of Mexico's democracy. There's lots of things wrong with it, lots of good things about it, but I'm going to focus on some of the things that are wrong with it in this talk. First, I'm going to talk about uneven subnational democratization. So I mentioned that Mexico is really made up of 32 different political systems. Some of them are dramatically more democratic than others. Or I could say it the other way, some of them are dramatically more authoritarian than others, because that is in fact the case. There's lots of authoritarian regimes that still exist within Mexico. And so I want to explore what that means for democracy at the national level. Second thing wrong with Mexico's democracy is weak institutions and rule of law. Here I'm talking less about elections and electoral procedures than about the institutions of the state, things like the judicial system, the police force, the ability to enforce the law, to punish criminals. Obviously, I'll be talking about the drug cartels here, but it goes beyond that. Just a general level of not deinstitutionalization, but weak institutions. And again, there's a variety of realities within Mexico. Some states are better than others, and we'll be exploring that too. And then the third one, which is actually sort of near and dear to my heart, but I'm not going to talk about it in this talk, is socioeconomic and political equality. I think Mexico is a very poor country in many ways. It's highly unequal from a socioeconomic perspective, and that has political ramifications. So that, I think, is a challenge for any democratic system when huge political inequalities and economic inequalities exist. I won't be dwelling on those in this talk. I'd be happy to answer questions after the talk about poverty and democracy in Mexico. As I proceed through the talk, I'd like you guys to think about two big questions. These are two questions that I'm wrestling with. So I'd like you to wrestle with me. The first is, what is the relationship between local and national democratic transitions in federal states? As I said, Mexico is a federal system. Elections happen at the national, state, and local level. Not all of them are clean. Not all of them are competitive. Not all of them are fair. What does that mean when there's this sort of imbalance? One point that emerges, I think, immediately is that we can't assume that if a country is democratic, all subnational units within it will be democratic, right? And I want to explore what that means, right? I guess, which is more dominant? Do local authoritarian regimes influence negatively the national political system, or is it the other way around? Does a national democratic system slowly but surely erode these authoritarian enclaves and kind of, if you will, sort of create a trickle-down democracy? I'll be arguing that in Mexico, we don't have trickle-down democracy. We have trickle-up, maybe authoritarianism. We'll see. The second question is democracy possible where states are weak? Mexico is a weak state, has weak institutions, especially at the local level. Recent history, Iraq and Afghanistan, have shown that where the state is weak, where the state can't control violence, where it can't control territory, elections don't mean very much, right? People don't turn out to the polls. Those who turn out to the polls aren't necessarily representative of the population at large. Election fraud is rampant. You can't trust the outcomes of elections. Nigeria is an example of this. Nigeria holds elections pretty regularly. Pretty regularly, those elections fail, right, in one way or another. So where the state is weak, it's really hard to have free and fair and competitive elections, right? And worst case scenario might be you have free, fair, and competitive elections, and then the results aren't recognized, right? And there's no state institution strong enough to enforce the outcomes. So those are the two big questions. What's the relationship between subnational and national democratization? And can we have a democracy where the state is weak? I notice a lot of you are Latin American studies aficionados, if not majors. You may or may not know something about Mexico. I'm not going to assume a lot of knowledge, so I'm going to give you a sort of a really brief synopsis of the Mexican political system. Very similar to the United States. In fact, the Constitution was modeled after the US Constitution. It has a presidential system. There's some tweaks to it. I'll point those out. It has a presidential system. Elections are every 6 years for president, so unlike the US where they're every 4 years. And they're non-renewable terms. So no re-election is a cornerstone of Mexico's democratic political system. It's almost has been for 70 years a non-negotiable aspect. Basically term limits, a one-term term limit for all elected positions. So presidents can only run and be presidents for one term, governors for one term, mayors for one term, congressmen, senators. Every elected position has a one-term term limit. The idea is the goal is to eliminate the possibility of a perpetuation of power through elections. Another similarity with the United States is the separation of powers. There's 3 branches. There's the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The legislative branch is very similar to the US branch. It's bicameral. There's a House and a Senate. The House is called the Chamber of Deputies. One tweak is that it's a mixed PR system. That means they elect 300 in the House. They elect 300 representatives through a first-past-the-post system, much like we do in the United States. There's districts, 1 representative from each district is elected to the Chamber of Deputies, but they also allocate 200 seats through a PR system, a proportional representation system. So according to the percentage of votes that a party receives, they get a chunk or a share of those 200 seats. And there's also a mixed PR system in the Senate as well. 3 main parties, PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. The PRI is the Institutional Revolutionary Party. It's the party that had been in power in Mexico for 70 plus years, from about 19, well, it depends when you start counting, but let's say the late 20s through 2000. It oversaw a one-party authoritarian system in Mexico. The PAN is a right-of-center party. A lot of people compare it to the Republican Party in the United States. It has been in power for the last 12 years. And the PRD is the main center-left party. It has never held the presidency. It has some success at the state and local level, but of the 3 parties, it's traditionally been the smallest of the 3 main parties. A couple more words about the federal system. There's federal, state, and municipal governments. What that means is that not only is there shared authority across these levels, there are elections at each level. So Mexicans elect the president, they elect governors, and they elect mayors. They also elect, like we do in, say, Utah, at the state level, there's bicameral legislatures with the Senate and a House, and they elect state representatives, state senators, and state representatives. And at the municipal level, they elected the equivalent of city councils, right? So very similar. I mean, you could almost put the 2 federal systems side by side, and they'd line up really nicely. 2,400 plus municipalities. The elections aren't concurrent. They're staggered. Every state decides what year they want to have elections. That means there's thousands of elections in Mexico every year. Mexicans are really good at holding elections. They're not as good at counting the votes, but they're really good at holding elections. And that's been a touchstone in debates about the quality of democracy in Mexico, right? And it's actually, it's one of those troublesome points for political scientists. We like to identify democracies by whether or not elections happen, particularly at the national level, right? And I'm going to sort of turn our gaze, as I said before, to these elections at the state and local level, right? It's quite possible that the presidential elections are free and fair, but I want to consider the possibility that these 2,400 plus elections are not free and fair, and what that means. Last little bit of, actually two last little bits of information. Mexico has a large, vibrant economy. It's the 14th largest economy in the world, just right behind Australia, just ahead of South Korea. Per capita income of 6,300. It's considered a middle-income country. It's the third largest trading partner of the United States, behind Canada and China, very close to China. Even though it's a middle-income country, even though it's industrializing and growing, there's still a lot of poverty. Poverty levels change. Poverty levels vary according to how you measure poverty. This very conservative measure of poverty, whether or not a family earns $180 or less a month. If you use that measure, poverty in Mexico is right around 50%. Right? It's a staggering number. And as I said, there's also very high income inequality. Poverty tends to be concentrated in these darker states, these maroon, reddish, I'd say crimson colors. No? Okay. U of U? Red? No, okay. There's one state in the north, but you can tell that Mexico's kind of divided in two. There's a north and a south. The north tends to be wealthier, more industrialized. The south, more rural, poorer. The north, incidentally, is also where most of the drug violence is. So that's a bit unusual, but speaking of drug violence, so the two last little bits of information. Showing maps of Mexico. These days, you can't show a map of Mexico without showing the distribution of the cartels. There's three main cartels. It's an evolving dynamic situation. Sinaloa, Zetas, and Gulf cartels are the three main ones. The Knights Templar La Familia in Michoacan, if you know Mexico, is another important one. But basically, there are three large cartels that control the coasts. The Zetas control the Gulf Coast. The Sinaloa cartel controls the Pacific coast, and both, as you can see, control key border crossing points. A main, not the, but a main task of these drug cartels in Mexico is to shuttle drugs from Colombia into Mexico and into the United States. And so having access to ports where the drugs can come in, and then border crossing points where the drugs can go out is really important. I give to you Mexico's next president, Enrique Peña Nieto, good-looking guy, married to soap opera star. What else can I say? We'll be talking about him later. He just won a contested election, I think that's fair to say, in Mexico back in July. And he'll be taking office December 1st, so imminently. Brief history of Mexico's political history. Mexico was known as the perfect dictatorship. Perfect dictatorship because one party controlled power uninterruptedly for 70 plus years while having regular elections and while enjoying, for most of its tenure, broad-based legitimacy, right? And that's unusual for authoritarian regimes to be in power that long and be legitimate that long. One of the things that means is that the PRI, which was in power, didn't have to use violence that much to stay in power, which also helped it as sort of a virtuous circle. It helped maintain its legitimacy because it didn't have to sort of wield its coercive powers as frequently. The PRI enjoyed almost complete monopoly over the government, right? And it achieved almost complete monopoly by winning elections. Almost 100% of all political positions, about 95% of mayoralities, 100% of governorships, 100% of Senate seats, about 80 to 90% of House seats, and 100% of presidential elections were controlled by and won over about 50 years by the PRI. Astonishing control over the political system. And it accomplished this through elections that were not free, that were not fair, and that were not competitive. And what I have here is that it would win 100% of the seats with 100% of the vote, right? It got so kind of entrenched in power that it had to create and fund opposition parties, right, to challenge it during elections so that it would look like elections were competitive, because otherwise they wouldn't be. That's how perfect it was. Another element that made it kind of a perfect dictatorship is, unlike South American military regimes that existed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the military was under civilian control. Right? That was not an issue that Mexico had to confront. So the PRI governed as a civilian party government without military intervention, without the fear of military coups. One key feature of Mexico's democracy was hyper-presidentialism. It was a federal system, but because power was so concentrated in one party, the president effectively exercised control over states and municipal governments, and then also over the legislature. There was an extensive system of patronage. Almost all politicians ultimately depended on the good graces of the president. He was the nominal party head, in addition to being the president. So politicians, in one way or the other, owed their political fortunes to the president. And so they, for example, in the House, they would tend to vote with the president. When I say tend to vote, I mean 95% of the time they approved the president's bills. There was no veto, there was no contestation, there was no, in the end, no checks and balances, right? And over time, without checks and balances, this institution of hyper-presidentialism developed. Also, very centralized system. The key aspect may have been that even though it was a federal system, only the national government collected taxes and distributed monies to state and local governments. That means the purse strings were completely controlled by the executive branch, which also contributed to hyper-presidentialism. This was one of the sort of more authoritarian features of Mexico's democracy during this period. You could identify a clear leader that was not quite authoritarian, because remember, the president could only be in power for one term, right? So the description that's often used is sort of king or emperor for 6 years, and then you have to step aside. And another sort of perfect feature of Mexico's democracy is that invariably presidents, who I remind you were all powerful during their tenure, stepped down, right? And that made it a perfect dictatorship, right? Of course, they handed the baton to one of their colleagues, who they handpicked. And so, again, it was a perfect dictatorship, not a perfect democracy. So given these features of Mexico's authoritarian regime, the transition to democracy, which began roughly in 1989, ended roughly in 2000, ended because Mexico became a democracy. The goal of the transition of political reforms during the time was to, one, make elections competitive. It was not possible to have the PRI win 100% of elections with 100% of the vote, right? So elections had to be competitive. They had to be free and fair, right? No more fraud, right? One of the key features of the transition to democracy was the establishment of what's known as the Federal Electoral Institute, the IFE. It runs, by and large, world-class elections today. It's harder to say this, but it's by and large very transparent, much more, the counting of votes right now in Mexico is much more transparent than in the United States, right, for example. It's much easier to know which districts, which counties, which states voted for what candidate in real time. They control finance, campaign finance spending. They control all aspects of the elections. And so importantly, the IFE is a non-governmental organization, right? It is not a county clerk, it's not a secretary of state, it's a non-governmental organization which ensures, or is supposed to ensure, the impartiality of the elections. So make elections competitive, make them free and fair, remove the PRI from power, and then decentralize, right? And decentralization was important to eliminate take away some of the underpinnings of hyper-presidentialism. We want this federal system that's established in the Constitution to be alive, to be real. The idea behind that is the closer government is to citizens, the more democratic, the more responsible, the more accountable it is, right? So those were the goals. Mexico looked like it achieved those goals in 2000 when the PAN defeated the PRI, the first electoral defeat of the PRI at the presidential level ever. In the 2000 elections, 42.5 versus 36.1% of the vote. So it's kind of a resounding defeat. Unlike the United States, Mexico doesn't have an electoral college, so it's the popular vote that determines the outcome. So 6-7 percentage point difference was huge. It was especially important that the margin was large because it was signaled the transition to democracy. Had it been close and contested, who knows whether the PRI would have recognized the results. But Mexico was considered to have become a democracy because the PAN won and the PRI recognized the results, right? It stepped away from power peacefully. So it was about a 10-year transition to democracy, no revolutions, no mass protests. It happened through institutional reform. One measure of whether a political system has consolidated its democracy is whether or not they have a successful second election, right? And Mexico passed that test. It was a difficult test. The PAN once again won, but they defeated the PRD by 0.5 percentage point this time. And with nothing resembling a mandate. They got just over a third of the votes, 35.9% of the votes, which means 65% of Mexicans voted against them, right? Oh well. But like the United States, you don't need a majority to win an election, right? A simple plurality is enough. So there were elections, there were accusations of fraud by the PRD, which lost. The PRD demanded a recount. The IFE, the partiality or the impartiality, rather, of the IFE was called into question. It was a moment in which Mexico's democracy was tested, and it passed, right? The institutions, the democratic institutions, did their job. They did a partial recount. They took their time. The elections were in July, and then around September, they declared Felipe Calderón of the PAN the winner. It was recognized by almost everybody except the losing candidate, López Obrador of the PRD, who declared himself the legitimate president of Mexico and created a sort of parallel shadow cabinet. And he, I don't know what to say about that. I guess that was the hiccup in Mexico's democratic election, that a key player did not recognize the results, right? But the PRI, came in third. This was positive for two reasons. One is it was the PRD that is sort of challenging the legitimacy of the elections, not the old institutional party. And the PRI, by all accounts, was dead, right? It had, in 12, sorry, that should be 2006. These are 2006 elections. In 6 short years after losing power, the PRI had fallen to be a third option for most Mexicans, right? Even though the elections were contested, one indisputable fact was that the PRI was no longer a threat, so to say, to take power, right? People considered that, again, sort of this second test of a democracy, of second election as a key test for democracy. Mexico passed more or less with flying colors because the largest threat to democracy, the PRI, became a non-player. The PAN governed for a total of 12 years, so from 2000 to 2012. They lost the 2012 elections to the PRI, okay? And I'm going to get to those elections at the end of the talk. But just to sort of recap, These were the main goals of the electoral reforms, and they were accomplished. Elections were free and fair. They were competitive. The same party won, but the elections were really close. The PRD jumped the PRI as the second largest party. The PRI was no longer in power, and I didn't mention this, but the Calderón undertook a series of decentralization reforms that gave more power to state and local governments. One key feature of this decentralization is that it gave actually more power to governors than to municipalities. Sort of it kind of continued a bit of a hierarchy, but nonetheless, the president was much less powerful under the PAN than under the PRI. So local governments, state and local governments had more power, right? But the focus of democratic reforms was to change the electoral institutions. The institutions of the state and the institutions at the local, state, and local level were by and large ignored by reformers and policymakers. So even though the IFE, which runs in the national elections, is a world-class electoral organization, the state-level electoral institutes, the IAs, are a mess. They don't have much capacity. They don't have enough funding. The people who staff it aren't always competent. In some states, they work beautifully, and in some states, they serve to legitimate the power of governors who, by hook and crook, try to stay in power or try to keep their power and their power group in power. So there's huge unevenness in the quality of democracy, right? And the quality of electoral oversight in Mexico. The PRI lost the presidency, but it's maintained a majority control over state governments. After the 2012 election, they controlled 19 of the 31 state governments. That's about 60%. As I said, the real winners of decentralization were state governments. That means that governors have emerged as the new power brokers in Mexico, replacing the president, right? So instead of having one basically power broker at the top of a power pyramid, now you've got 31 or 32 if you count Mexico City, power brokers with enormous power over their what I'll call fiefdoms. Some of those governors are good guys, good gals. About 19 of them are not, right? They are autocratic. They try to stay in power by all means necessary, including influencing the elections by handpicking the members who sit on the IAS boards. Clientelism and fraud, therefore, exists. It goes unpunished in a lot of state and local elections. And what I'll say is, instead of national level democracy trumping authoritarian enclaves, which was the hope, right? It's the other way around. Authoritarian enclaves, these autocratic governors are actually thriving. And they're thriving because of decentralization. Even though Calderón might have wanted to, or Fox before him, the PAN presidents might have wanted to impose more democratic reforms on these state governments, those presidents couldn't, because decentralization empowered governors over the president. Let me show you how this plays out a little bit in Mexico through some primarily survey evidence. This chart shows the responses to a question in 4 surveys from 1997 to 2006 about whether or not Mexicans thought the elections were clean, right? Was there fraud or was there not fraud? The main features are between 1997 and 2000, as you'd expect. And the 3 lines represent 3 income groups: low, middle, and high income. All income groups reported elections to be cleaner, right? That is less fraud. What's troubling from a perspective of functioning democracies is that from 2000 to 2003 and 2003 to 2006, the percentage of people saying that elections were not clean went up. This is the same period of time in which Mexico was supposed to be consolidating its democracy. But perceptions of fraud, which is a measure of whether or not fraud is occurring, went up. and they skyrocketed in 2006 for high-income individuals, right? So this is just, for me as a political scientist, a social scientist, is a hint that all is not well. The surveys aren't out yet, but my guess is if you did it, if you asked this question in 2012, perceptions of fraud would be higher still. This is by state, so I'm going to start unpacking democracy at the state level. This is perceptions of fraud by state. The black bars show the percentage of people within each state that thought elections were fraudulent in their state, right? That the presidential elections were fraudulent. Two things to notice. The first is that there's a huge diversity, in Nuevo León, maybe 5%, I forget what the actual number is, maybe 4% of people thought elections were not clean. I think that's great, right? That tells me that elections in Nuevo León are probably pretty clean, fair, free of fraud. But in Mexico City, in Oaxaca, Guerrero, oops, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. How'd I get all the way over there? In these states, close to 50, or in Mexico City's case, more than 50% of people thought elections were not clean. That's horrible. That's intolerable. That should not happen in democracy, right? If you were to average all these numbers, you get this, right? About 25 to 30% of people thinking elections are fraudulent, right? What do we think about 30%? That's not great. We'd wish it were more like 10 or 15%, but maybe 30% is okay. Maybe it's okay, except that in some places, a near majority think elections are fraudulent, right? So this shows you part of that diversity in political systems. This chart reports changes in perceptions of fraud between 2000 and 2006. Again, two things to note. The first is that in only 3 states did perceptions of fraud go down. In every other state in Mexico, perceptions of fraud increased, right, between these 2 elections, at the same time that Mexico was supposed to be consolidating its democracy. And then the second feature is, again, that the diversity of realities, right, on the ground. Right? In some places, the quality of democracy at the state level got a lot worse. In some places, it only got a little worse. So that's what I'm going to say about elections, right? The punchline is there's 31 realities in Mexico, and not all state and local elections meet the benchmark of free, fair, and competitive elections. Weak institutions and rule of law. This is where the drug cartels figure in. Again, there's been an emphasis in reforming national level institutions without reforming state and local level institutions. At the same time that Mexican governments have granted more power to state and local governments. So police systems are horrible. Police are underpaid, they're undertrained. Judges are undertrained, corrupt. It's hard to prosecute crime. It's hard to catch criminals. It's hard to collect taxes. It's hard to do almost anything and everything that governments do at these state and local levels. So decentralization gave more power to state and local governments, but without increasing their capacity to actually govern. And what I'm going to argue is that this created an opportunity that drug cartels are really beginning to exploit. You've got state and local governments that are powerful, right? But you can overrun them because they're not very capable. They don't have a lot of capacity. And that contributes, now we're into a vicious circle, right? That contributes to weakening institutions because some of these powerful players have no incentive to strengthen institutions. There's another button down here, that's what happens. So, the familiar story that you've probably heard and read about in Mexico is that drug cartels bribe and control the police force, and they do. I was in Oaxaca this summer, and one of my friends was telling me how his cousin, who's a good guy by all accounts, was a lieutenant in the local police force and wanted to become captain or commander. And he had gotten all of the sort of merit requirements to become commander, but he was repeatedly sort of overlooked and not promoted. And finally, he was told that if he wanted the promotion, he needed to pay the equivalent of about $4,000 to $6,000 depending on the exchange rate. Let's say $5,000 to become commander, right? It's kind of a bribe. And I thought, that's horrible, but it's probably okay, right? $5,000 for a career-long promotion, right? Except it was $5,000 a month. That's what the policeman had to pay his chief a month to be in power. So how is he going to, if his salary is about $400 a month, how is he going to come up with $5,000 a month to keep his job? Drug cartels are paying about $10,000 a month, by the way, for captains and commanders. With the police force firmly in the pockets of those who can pay, there's no impunity. It's in fact the opposite, right? Sorry, there is impunity. There's no sort of prosecution of crime. The police act as lookouts for drug cartels. In some states where police forces and government officials refuse to be bought out, they just resign en masse, right? Imagine if the Provo Police Department resigned, all of them, tomorrow. And then imagine if the Provo City Council and Mayor resigned because it was too dangerous and they didn't want to take bribes anymore. Right? Now, imagine nobody wanting to take their place and imagining living for 6 months without a police force, without a local government, right, without a city council. That's what some towns in Mexico are experiencing. Imagine the military coming in and having a firefight with the local police, not the drug cartels, the local police, over control of Provo. Right. That's what's happening in Mexico. The level of violence is insane. I had to update, I gave a talk similar to this one about 6 months ago. I had to update the number of people killed from 42,000 to 60,000. Right. Estimates are that 15,000 people get killed every year in the so-called drug war in Mexico. Levels of violence in Mexico are astonishing. They're horrific. It's why the PAN lost the elections in 2012. Mexicans are sick, less of the corruption, they're sick of the violence. To give you another sense of how the state has failed in Mexico, this is a military convoy delivering pensions in the state of Sonora. The drug cartels control the territory, and for 6 months they didn't allow Social Security checks into this small town. Right? It's not hard to do. Who delivers Social Security checks? It's your postman, right? They're unarmed. They're not going to stand up to the drug cartels. But after 6 months, the town was literally starving, and so the military had to deliver the mail. Right? So what does this mean for democracy? So let me give you a couple of things. On the one hand, this is part of the traditional story. The cartels threaten the capacity of the state to protect civil and political rights. The one that's suffering sort of most immediately is freedom of the press. Journalists, reporters are not free to investigate drug cartels. They're not free to investigate corruption. There are more journalists are killed in Mexico every year than in almost any country in the world. Right? More than in Afghanistan, more than in Iraq, more than in Syria. It's a horrible place to be a journalist. Human rights abuses are growing. The military is in charge of the war against drugs. They are not known to be to respect human rights, right? The military is a bit like the United States. The Constitution does not charge the military with enforcing the rule of law. It's meant to fight external enemies, right? And so they don't have sort of rigid internal procedures to protect political and civil rights. So human rights abuses are growing without any punishment. There's electoral violence. Governors are assassinated, mayors are assassinated, citizens are threatened. People don't go to the polls as a result. That infringes on people's freedom of speech, right? Their right to vote. If you're not free to vote, That's an essential right that is restricted. One example is in Sinaloa. The PAN removed its entire, I think it was delegation of 60 candidates for state and local offices because it could not guarantee that its candidates were free of the influence of drug cartels. So citizens in primaries, imagine the Republican Party has a primary in Utah and elects its slate of representative of candidates for all the seats, and the National Republican Party pulls all of those candidates, imposes its own, because it doesn't trust Utah's self-selected candidates. There's issues of freedom of speech, voting rights, etc., that are at stake there because of the corruption. And as I said before, we don't have to worry in Mexico about the military acting as a veto player, not recognizing elections, but the cartels are acting as veto players, assassinating mayors, etc. The new dynamic, which is more troubling to me, is that the cartels have recognized the weakness of local, state, and local governments. Instead of fighting them head on, they're becoming them, right? So it's one thing, so we're buying them, we're buying off politicians, but we can also finance their campaigns because campaign finance laws at the state and local level are almost non-existent. So we'll fund our candidates, our preferred candidates, right? And they'll win democratically by outspending their opponents. And when you look at it from the outside as an observer, it looks like a fair election. Just one candidate raised more money than the other. It's all drug money, however, right? Better yet, let's run our own candidate and fund, right? So drug leaders are running as mayoral candidates. And the danger is, to the extent they have more resources than any other individual or party or organization, they win, and instead of fighting the state, they become the state. Implications for the election that just happened. So cartels are using these thousands and thousands and thousands of elections that happen every year to gain control of the state little by little. Now, that's bad, yes? It's worse when another cartel says, hey, we could be doing the same thing. So they finance their own candidate, or they run their own candidate, right? And then the street battles become political battles. And then, you know, it just sort of escalates. And there's more violence, more assassination. So when I hear that a politician is assassinated, and the line is always, he was assassinated because he was fighting corruption. He was fighting the drug cartels. Yes, right? It's one cartel killing off the other cartel. That's what it is, right? They were getting too close to winning, so we got to take them out, right? And so the sort of street violence, which is bad, is creeping into political violence. So cartels are using elections to fight for territory. Local elections are a new source of violence. This spread to new places in Mexico. And my prediction is that cartels will be even more entrenched in the Mexican state after 2012, regardless of the effectiveness of the war on drugs. And here's how I will know that cartels are more entrenched, is the violence goes down. Because if you're in power and you control power and you're not challenged, there's nobody killed. Right? So once cartels are firmly entrenched, turf battles end, violence goes down. Right? Violence is still high. But remember me when Peña Nieto declares partial victory on the war on drugs. Okay? It means cartels are in government. So note the irony, and now I'm just going to start to conclude. Mexico's a democracy. Everybody calls Mexico a democracy. They call it a democracy based on the fact that there's no authoritarian leader. There are free and fair elections by and large at the national level. But Mexico's kind of unique among democracies in that there's infringements on civil and political liberties, but it's not the state that is threatening citizens, that it's not an authoritarian leader, it's cartels, right? that are threatening political and civil liberties, and it's the state that wants to but can't protect its own citizens. Is that a democracy? By the book it is. Right? But I want to sort of challenge that. That's what I'm thinking about. Where did I put my clicker? Wrong way. So, is Mexico a failed state? This is a question that I get asked quite frequently. Mexico is not a failed state, but it's failing from the bottom up. Right? It's pretty strong at the national level, but at the state and local level, it's failing. Is Mexico a democracy? By the book, it is. Right? But its state and local politics are damaging national democratic procedures, right? I think that the direction of influence is not from a national government democratizing state and local governments. It's from authoritarian state and local governments affecting national politics negatively. Let me jump ahead to Peña Nieto. Actually, no, let me jump ahead to Peña Nieto. I'll pause here for a second. If you want to think about what state and local authoritarian regimes might mean, think of the United States under Jim Crow laws, right? Or even before, right, during slavery, right? Was the U.S. a democracy when African Americans could not vote in elections between 1880s and 1960? The U.S. was a democracy at the national level, but at the state and local level, it was not, right? So we've got sort of another parallel with the United States. Enrique Peña Nieto, a few things about his election. Enormous challenges by the PRD, which lost, accusing his campaign of fraud, right? Whether or not fraud existed, the allegations were credible, and they were believed by lots and millions of citizens. So Mexicans, I think, are losing faith in the quality of elections at the national level. What used to be a world-class electoral system at the national level is starting to break down. Right? He won over the PRD, 38-31, not that close, but closer than people thought originally. He does not have a majority in either House or Senate. Right? That's going to make it more difficult for him to govern. He's going to have to form coalitions. That's good. That's fine for democracy. The PRD is not going to play long. They're going to be the obstructionist party in Parliament. This is the breakdown. I won't say much about this, except that to say one more thing about Peña Nieto and the PRI. So people are, on the one hand, afraid that the PRI is back in power, and that there's a danger that they will once again reestablish themselves as the dominant ruling party in Mexico. I don't think that's possible anymore, right? At the national level, parties are established enough, competitive enough, institutionalized enough to sort of create a permanent challenge to one-party rule, right? Plus decentralization, the PRI cannot control all state and local governments like it did before. The real danger is twofold. One is this creeping ability of parties to commit fraud in elections at all levels now. And it's not just the PRI, it's the PRD and the FAN that are guilty of this. And then second is he does not have a great democratic track record. This is another way that authoritarian subnational government trickles up. He was an autocratic governor who won elections and stayed in power through political violence, repression, and fraud. And he's the president of Mexico. Right? He was a very successful governor, and he's the first in that generation of autocratic governors to become president. And there's a long line of people that might follow him. So Mexico is at this crucial turning point. The drug cartels are a danger. Deinstitutionalization, weak institutions are a danger. And now we have a president whose commitment to democracy, whose commitment to strengthening institutions is in question. So those are some of the things that are wrong with Mexico's democracy. I'll open up for questions.
Do you think that there will ever be that they'll ever find a solution to fight the war on drugs? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Solution is easy.
Cartels.
Make a deal with them. That's what's going to happen.
But you don't think they'll ever be eradicated?
And I'll tell you why not. Because the demand for drugs in the United States is insatiable. The drug cartels exist in Mexico because there's a huge market for drugs in the United States. And Mexico is unfortunate enough in this case to be the U.S.'s southern neighbor, right? And so drugs, that's sort of the natural waypoint. The free trade agreement, NAFTA, makes it that much easier for merchandise, cars, and drugs, like to enter the United States from Mexico, right? So as long as the United States, so notice I'm not blaming Mexico. As long as the United States does little or nothing to combat the use of drugs, of illegal drugs in the United States, right? Mexico is screwed.
We talked a little bit about the term limits. Basically, every elected position is a 6-year term, and that's it. How do you think that works compared to if they didn't have term limits?
So one of the key reforms that would improve the quality of democracy in Mexico, in my opinion, is the elimination of these term limits, right? What happens with these term limits is, if you want to continue your political career, you're not accountable to the people who voted you in because they can't vote you back in. You're accountable to your party, right? Who then, okay, you are in the House, let's move you to the Senate. Okay, Senate, let's make you a governor. Okay, now you're going to be in the cabinet, let's move you around. So you are accountable to your party, not to your citizens. So one of the big problems, which I didn't mention, but it's a problem, is the lack of accountability of elected representatives to the people who elected them. And so the goal is to eliminate this really stringent term limits. And I think that'll be a positive. And it's they're debating, right? I think it'll pass under Peña Nieto. And Mexico should become, parties should become more representative, more accountable after that rule.
How much do you think that those polls about the perception of fraud actually represent actual fraud?
I think people want to believe that elections are clean. I think there's gossip and rumor that is not always true. But it's sort of a smoking gun. If there's perceptions of fraud, something's going on. So I don't think it's perfect. I don't know of any other way to actually measure fraud, right? Because you try to not make it super evident. But people are the ones that are going to the polling booths. They're the ones talking to the neighbors. They're the ones that are being approached by political parties and asked, being sort of, given $100 to vote for the PRI. Right? So they know. They're the ones who know the best.
So is that perception also
So I think it's a little inflated.
does it make more people not want to vote?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Which is something that's wrong with Mexico. Who was next? Are you deferring? So, up there, Katya, and then you.
My question goes back to the term limits. Do you feel that if there was no term limit, that would also cause a similar problem?
So you mean no term limits at all?
Yeah,
Like the U.S.
yeah,
Like Orrin Hatch?
yes, like more than that.
It's one of those things that I think there'll be term limits in Mexico. There's that danger. I think it's maybe a bigger danger in Mexico because institutions are weaker. And you can use financial resources more easily to to accumulate power, political power. So I think that would be a bigger danger, but I don't think it's going to happen. Katya.
Yeah, going back to the beginning of your lecture, you talked about how the PRI was a perfect
Dictatorship.
Authoritarianism. And I wonder where was the opposition at that time? And also, if today there's a group that offer any hope for the future of Mexico?
So the opposition was, mostly the opposition was removed. So the FAN was always there, right? The center-right party. Its main platform was democratization, but it never got more than 5-10% vote. Then there was a leftist opposition, communist parties, socialist parties, and they were the ones that were most likely to be brutally repressed. They faced the hammer of the state. And they also never got more than 5-10%. But because of, the FAN was never really repressed, the leftist parties were. And then there was an opposition that was called the loyal opposition. Basically, it was opposition parties who nominated the PRI candidate to be their presidential candidate. And they got something in exchange. And so the PRI won 80-70% of the vote. And the rest was sort of divided among 7 or 8 different parties. Today, so the hope, I'll say youth. There's this movement called Yo Soy 132, I'm 132. There was a group of 131 students that protested Peña Nieto's visit to a university campus in Mexico. 131 students protested. A Twitter campaign, it's hashtag Yo Soy 132, I am 132, I am the 132nd person protesting Peña Nieto. And it's grown, it's sort of used media and technologies really savvily. They've held street protests. And so a lot of people are hopeful that there's this younger generation that didn't grow up with a PRI, that want a democracy, right? We'll see. I mean, I think there's some hope there. The danger is that if the political system remains entrenched and kind of the same, they'll become disenchanted and disillusioned. There's a distinct possibility that those movements can become violent, right? Mexico's at a crossroads in a bunch of different ways. So these social movements could be channeled, could be demobilized, they could be channeled positively, they could become violent.
So the middle class and the elite usually don't get involved?
Yeah, I mean, the middle class was the one that voted the PRI out. They supported the FAN. The problem with the FAN is that, oh my God, the violence. And Calderon had no clue. He just did not have a clue. He was negotiating with some civil rights, some civil society organizations to erect a monument for victims of the war on drugs. They negotiated what it was going to look like, where it was going to be, etc. And then he unilaterally changed the location from a sort of prominent park to right next to the military academy, right? And the victims' families blamed the military, right, for the deaths of their loved ones. And he has no clue. He had no clue. And the levels of violence are destroying the fabric of society in Mexico. So the youth, the middle class youth, are a hope. But there's now a generation of youth who have grown up with violence, with intense violence. I was going to show you some pictures. My wife told me not to. Go to Google war on drugs, Mexico, and then go to images. Brutal desensitization about violence completely, and that's a lost generation.
So shortly after the election, I read an article in which Peña Nieto called for a debate on the war on drugs with getting the U.S. involved. And he said that he wanted to end the violence and end looking for cartel leaders, and instead just try to build up a border between the United States. But I don't know. I don't really feel comfortable too much with what he said. So I don't know if you know much about that or.
I think he backtracked. He said, no, I didn't really mean that. I am going to go after kingpins. But what he's going to do is he's not going to go after all the kingpins. He's going to go after all the kingpins but two. So it's going to look like Google, war on drugs, Mexico. In the last 3 months since the election, finally, the Calderon administration has started to capture some really high level drug cartel leaders. They're all from one cartel, the Zetas. The most violent, the most anti-institutional, right? What's going on, according to my uninformed opinion, because I don't know anything about drug cartels, is that they are in cahoots with the Gulf and the Sinaloa cartel, who are being directly negatively affected by the Zetas, and they are squeezing the Zetas, eliminating them as players, so that only two cartels remain, with whom the Mexican government can negotiate. Off the record, I didn't say this if you asked me. I know it's being recorded, but that is President Fox, Vicente Fox, who was elected in 2000, governed from 2000 to 2006. He told Calderon, negotiate with the cartel. That's the only way out of this. The U.S. is not going to legalize drugs. That would fix the problem. But the U.S. is not going to legalize drugs. Peña Nieto wants the U.S. to legalize drugs, but he can't say that. He also can't say, I'm negotiating with the cartels, right? But when he says, I'm going to stop going after the kingpins, he's going to stop going after the kingpins. Just do it. So I think that's the only way out. And to be honest, Mexicans would say, I'd say 50%, 60% would say, yeah, negotiate. You gotta put an end to this.
So I understand that Peña Nieto in some ways is a threat to democracy.
To be seen, right?
Sorry?
To be seen.
Right, to be seen. So, but just first to have like reformation at the state level, reform, and fixes, would you need a strong federal leader like that for that to happen? Could he help in that way?
Yeah, I think that's smart. That's a really smart comment. I think that's what has to happen. There's a danger to that if that it reasserts sort of federal control. But if it's true that the federal government is more democratic than state and local ones, then it's probably net positive. Calderon, for example, just like the United States, police forces are local, right? You got local police, city police, state police, county police, all that stuff. Calderon, the previous president, proposed a constitutional amendment to make the police a federal police. No more state and local police. This would be an example of centralization, right? Because the local police just can't fight the cartels, so we need to sort of scale them up. It went nowhere, right? To get a constitutional amendment like that, you have to have governors on board, and it's not clear that they would be on board. Now, Peña Nieto could get them on board because he's of the PRI, and 19 of the governors are PRI governors. But if he were doing it, we'd have to see, right? If he is an authoritarian figure, whether his intentions would be pure, so to speak, right? I think there's a danger of centralizing power with negative consequences. But that's one solution, is if the federal state is stronger, has more capacity, that has to be on the table. So I'll stay as long as people want and until Katia or somebody shuts it off.
So you were saying that Mexico right now is kind of a democracy, like according to textbooks, but not really because of the corruption. Is it possible for Mexico to become an actual legitimate democracy without moving the drug cartels, or are the cartels, as long as the cartels are there, are they going to keep Mexico from becoming an actual legitimate democracy?
So just to clarify a little bit, the textbooks focus on, the definition of democracy focus on national level politics, on national elections. So national elections are free and fair. Textbooks call a country democratic. Then there are those that have other definitions. freedom of speech, our political and civil rights protected. That's where Mexico starts to break down. The textbooks focus on the state, right? Say Peña Nieto. Is Peña Nieto going after citizens? Is he cracking down on protesters, right? But if it's not the state that's cracking down on protesters, it's drug cartels, right? If it's not the state that's silencing journalists, the drug cartels, right? Textbooks would still call it a democracy, right? What I'm thinking about is, it's okay. So the perpetrators of the undemocratic politics are different, drug cartels versus government leaders, but the outcomes are more or less the same, right? The elections at the state and local level aren't free and fair in a lot of places. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of organization are under threat. Do we start to rethink whether or not Mexico is a democracy? I don't know. I'm not ready to go there yet. So I'm thinking about what it means to have a political system. And so let's go back to Afghanistan, right? If you know anything about Afghanistan, you know that Karzai controls about this much of a country this big, right? And the rest is controlled by the Taliban, warlords, the United States military, et cetera, right? And so can we call the Karzai government a democratic government, right? If he only controls so much territory, right? In effect, the Mexican government is losing control over territory, right? And how politics happens in these territories, right? If it can't control, if it can't ensure that elections are free and fair, it's not the cause of unfair elections, but it's not ensuring, can't guarantee that they're free and fair. What does that make Mexico? Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So, but before this whole sort of loss of power, the PRI and the decentralization of power, like how, I mean, weren't there already like drug cartels and they had interests before? So I mean, did they just? So it wasn't a problem because they worked through, you know, because the one party was so dominant, and now it's a problem because there's like competition.
So if you didn't hear him, once upon a time there were drug cartels. There have always been drug cartels because the U.S. has always had an appetite for drugs. But there were fewer of them, and they knew who to negotiate with, the PRI, right? And the PRI kind of kept them under control. And so it wasn't a problem. Of course it was a problem, right? But it wasn't a visible problem because it was kind of everything was institutionalized, right? But with democracy, right? Suddenly the PRI is not in power, so who do you negotiate with as a drug cartel? Well, then you got it, right? Oh, but he's already been bought by the other cartel. What do I do now? Well, violence starts, right? So democracy, one of the ironies too is that democracy and decentralization, right, created multiple bargaining partners for drug cartels, right? And politicians who are political entrepreneurs who want to sort of, you know, try to get power, they're also entrepreneurial about sort of recruiting bribes from, soliciting bribes from drug cartels. And they can go, you know, if you don't give me a good deal, I can go to a different drug cartel, right? And so it's created a much more fluid situation that I think has created multiple openings for multiple cartels, right? So before, no new cartels would emerge because any cartel had to negotiate with a PRI. Now cartels are free to emerge with every new candidate, every new election, right? And in fact, sort of the chart that I showed is already a little bit out of date. It's a 2010 chart, I think. Alliances are forming, new cartels are emerging. It's kind of like this. This is what cartel life kind of looks like in Mexico. They grow, they shrink, they blend. So it's much more fluid and much harder to control. So yeah, they've always existed. And in fact, we can blame the PRI in some ways, right, for not doing more when it could. And Calderon inherited the drug cartels. But his strategy of taking out kingpins, the argument there is that when you take out each of them become rival factions that try to reassert power. And that's where a lot of